Hi, my name's Simon Jones. I'm the founder of Air Quality Matters, and this is a short presentation on ventilation and air quality and why it matters in housing. So what we're going to go through in this presentation is air quality and why it should matter to all of us. We're going to have a little bit of a think about ventilation and first principles, why we should care about some of the standards and rules and how that might influence some of our decisions in buildings. We're also going to have a little bit of a think about the future and where environmental monitoring might come into play increasingly within our housing stock. And finally, just a little bit of a thought around how ventilation strategies might influence outcomes more in the built environment. As I said, my name's Simon Jones. I'm the founder of Air Quality Matters. I also host a podcast on air quality that talks to international guests on this subject matter, and I wear a number of other hats, including working for the International Energy Agency as the chair of the industry advisory body that advises on ventilation and air quality, amongst many other things. So if we're lucky enough to live to 80 years of age, or our children, more importantly, are lucky enough to live to 80 years of age, we'll spend close to 70 years of that indoors. If you're vulnerable, or from certain sectors of the community, that may be significantly more. 55 years of that time is likely to be in your own home. So regardless, when we're talking about air quality, whether we're thinking about outdoor air or indoor air, the vast majority of our exposure to this risk will occur in our own homes. In fact, 25 years of that time in one room in our house, our bedroom, where we'll be asleep and unable to react to the conditions that we find ourselves in. So when we talk about air quality, what do we actually mean? Well, if I was to take a glass jar and close the lid on it, what's in that jar? Well, there's gases that we care about, like oxygen and carbon dioxide when we think about global warming, and a bunch of other things that are inert and don't really affect us. But what we're really talking about today is air quality, the pollution, the stuff that we don't want there. So when we look at the kinds of pollution we find in the home, we see a broad mix of things. In fact, it's a very thick pea soup of chemicals and toxins and particles and gases that can cause us some degree of harm or another. As a simple example, if we look at the proportion of pollution that we find in typical homes in our part of the world, a third of them will be ethanol. That's alcohol-based chemicals that's used for evaporating and drying things like makeup and paint and varnish and all sorts of products that we find around the home. But ethanol in itself might not be that harmful to us. We do find some pollution, like particulate matter for example, or formaldehydes, that do cause us harm. Formaldehyde, as an example, is a class 1 carcinogen that can cause cancer. So how do we start to categorise the harm that these pollutants cause? Well, one way that we do this is through something called DALYs, Disability Adjusted Life Years. And what that means is a kind of public health measure that looks at the overall risk of early death and serious disability to one risk or another. To give a very simple example of that, we apply DALYs to smoking. So we know at a population level, per 100,000 of the population, 2,400 years are lost to life and disability through that risk. Road traffic deaths are around 1,000, as is alcoholism. So what about air quality? Well, indoor air quality represents over 2,000 years lost to disability and early death per 100,000 of the population. Twice as much as alcoholism and road traffic deaths. So it is a significant harm to us all. So what's causing us harm in our homes? Well, when we look at that big list of pollutants that we saw on a previous slide, what we find out is actually there are 4 or 5 key pollutants that cause us problems. Top of that list is particulate matter. So this presentation and some of the stuff you'll hear today is about condensation, damp and mould. And you might ask the question reasonably, where is that on this list? Well, some of that within the spores of mould appears in the particulate matter, amongst some of the other particles that are created from road traffic, pollution and cooking events in the home. But you might be surprised to know that 75% of all the harm that's caused in our home is driven through particulate matter. In fact, 95% of the harm is caused from those first 5 pollutants you see on that list. The good news is we know how to treat a lot of these pollutants. We can deal with them through adequate ventilation, decent local exhaust ventilation, an ability to purge our home, and controlling the types of materials and products that we bring into the home. But harm they cause us. Every time this is looked at, air quality is one of the single biggest environmental risks we face. It's associated, in the UK alone, with somewhere between 28,000 and 36,000 premature deaths per year. And this affects the most vulnerable in society the most. It's estimated to cost the UK alone nearly 20 billion per annum in health service costs, loss to productivity, absenteeism, the list goes on. And if we focus on some of the pollutants that we've just been talking about, there are very straight lines between some of those pollutants and health outcomes. Let's take radon, for example, a radioactive gas that finds itself in homes if you happen to be in the wrong area, a gas that we know how to manage with radon barriers and adequate ventilation. That gas alone causes nearly 1,100 cases of lung cancer that leads to death per year in the UK. Asthma, a disease we know is significantly exacerbated by poor living conditions, seriously impacts the health and well-being and lives of people living in homes. And I think you have to be living under a rock recently in housing not to be aware of the death of Awab Ishak, a 2-year-old boy in social housing, as a direct result of exposure to damp and mould and the conditions that he lived in. But even before Awab, there was the 9-year-old girl, Ella, who lived on the South Circular Road in London, who was the first case in the UK to have on her death certificate that the conditions of the air that she breathed in and around her home led to her death. So this thing affects us all, and we're now moving to a period of time where very straight lines are being drawn between health outcomes and the air and the quality of the air that we breathe. And of course, when we're talking about Awab Ishak and damp and mould, it brings us into the field of moisture in buildings. And we're having to start to think much more sophisticatedly about how we treat moisture and moisture balance. Every building has a healthy balance point, and it's a balance point that's affected by a range of systems within the building, whether that's fabric or systems like heating and ventilation, whether it's the use of the building or even the broader context that that building sits in, like whether it's in fuel poverty or it's over-occupied. All of these things interplay with each other and cause a building to shift in and out of moisture balance. And when that building is out of balance for a sustained period of time, that's where we start to see condensation, damp and mould forming. So when we talk about moisture balance, one of the key systems in controlling moisture balance, one of the pillars if you like, is ventilation. And the reason it's one of the key pillars is it's the principal tool that we have to limit the build-up of moisture vapour, the moisture that's in the air that we breathe, building up in our home. But we don't get it right enough. Every time this is looked at, we find widespread non-compliance with ventilation performance. Take just recently in the UK, we found nearly 95% non-compliance with even new builds that were handed over into the market. In Scotland in 2019, they looked at new homes and found 65% of the homes were significantly underventilated. But it's also how we think about ventilation and our perception of it. On the slide here, you'll see a natural ventilation system with intermittent fans. That's the ventilation system we're most used to in this country. That's where we have trickle vents in windows or holes in the wall, or an intermittent fans in the bathroom that come on when we go to the loo in the middle of the night. But we don't think about what it's like to live in that home. So if we take that living room in that particular slide, what's your experience of living with natural ventilation in that space? Well, your experience is cold air coming in through a hole in a window or a wall. What do we think about that? Do we perceive that as fresh air coming in to deal with the whole house, or do we perceive that as a draft? And our reaction often, and most of us have these vents in our home, is we see them as troublesome components of our building and we close them and we block them. Conversely, if we look at the experience of living in the bedroom in the top right of that image, we see warm air going out of a hole. That's the natural process of cross ventilation in a building. But our lived experience of that is that there's nothing going on. If we put our hand up to that vent, there's no air movement that we can feel. But it's a critical part of the whole process, and by closing one or other of those vents, we affect the ventilation in the hole. So how do we define what good ventilation is? How do we start to stand over what adequate ventilation that leads to decent air quality really means? Well, there's standards upon standards, and to be fair at this stage, it isn't a regulatory problem. We've known for a long time what adequate ventilation is. We understand what the intent of standards are. This really is a governance and delivery problem. So if we take undercuts under doors as a good example of our need to meet standards and provide adequate ventilation, by far and away the most common reason we see for underventilation in properties is the inability of air to move from one space to another. How do we do that? We do that by providing an adequate undercut under a door at least 10 millimetres above the finished floor level. And it's a challenging problem because it's not necessarily an electrician's or a plumber's or a ventilation expert's job to do joinery work and affect the undercut under a door. So the challenge with ventilation often is it's an inter-trade puzzle to fix. So by far and away the most common reason we find inadequate ventilation in properties is because of these undercuts. One of the founding principles of adequate ventilation is adequate background ventilation. And what do I mean by that? It's that fundamental principle of what is enough air for a property. And if we look at something like mechanical ventilation, this is where we provide the overall amount of air that a building needs through mechanical means. It's very straightforward actually to calculate what that is. It's either 0.3 litres per second per square metre, or there's a table that you can refer to based on the number of bedrooms that determines the flow rate for a property. Whichever of those two numbers is the greater, that's the number that you use. It's very simple. But back to my point in case, it's not a regulation problem, it's an application of that regulation problem. And what we often find is fans specified that aren't capable of meeting those determined flow rates. So in this image you see on screen, what you have is a relatively small apartment. It's 55 square metres and has 2 bedrooms. Well, based on the floor area, it only needs about 15 or 16 litres a second, but based on the bedrooms, it needs 25 litres a second. How is the mechanical system going to deliver that? Well, if it's a mechanical system, it's going to principally do that through extraction in the bathroom. That means that those two fans, one in the bathroom, one in the kitchen, have to deliver 25 litres a second between them. I can tell you that most of the fans that are being sold onto the market are not going to sustainably deliver 12.5 to 13 litres a second, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, without causing a noise problem. So this isn't about what's needed for the building, it's about the products that we choose to deliver what's needed for the building. And if that's not hard enough, we're now moving into the world where we're going to be judged by the ongoing performance of the spaces that we occupy and manage and rent. And increasingly, we're seeing some form of environmental monitoring or other appearing in these buildings. These environmental monitoring approaches have their own value, particularly in housing. So a good example of the kind of value that environmental monitoring can bring to landlords is that we can spot fuel poverty patterns early and intervene and stop a property moving into a space where it's going to generate damp and mould problems. We can see the conditions that are conducive to the development of mould before it starts to manifest and cause a problem. We can see if a property is void early and stop that property deteriorating and falling into disrepair, plus many other value propositions that this data brings. But be under no illusion, even if we're not putting this data into our properties or not pulling this data out of our properties, many of our tenants are already collecting this. So now when we're dealing with problem properties, we're faced with the reality that tenants have data on the performance of the buildings that they're renting, and that changes the dynamic of that conversation greatly. So we now have to start thinking strategically about ventilation and air quality in the places that we manage. And that starts with a proper diagnosis of the challenge. Where does ventilation work and where doesn't it in our properties? Do we have a real handle on the performance of ventilation in those properties? How do we come into contact with those properties? What touch points do we have within our organisation? Do we have housing teams, void teams, condensation, damp and mould response teams? How can we impact on better outcomes? What influence do we have over decisions? What could the consequences of certain actions be? And so on. That mapping process is absolutely critical to understand how we're going to deal with whatever scale of the problem that we have. Once we have that diagnosis of the challenge, we start to build frameworks around policies and outcomes. So this is where we start to build guiding policies that deal with the nature of the challenge. So this might be policies that deal with internal competencies within the organisation to manage ventilation and air quality. It might be that we start having proper performance testing of our ventilation through our portfolio to understand the kind of gaps that we're facing and what those workflows might look like. Once we have those guiding policies, we can then start to develop series of coherent actions that deal with those policies and the frameworks that they create. So that might be, for example, having a ventilation lead within your organisation. That means having somebody that you can go to that can assess the performance of the ventilation and provide advice to other team members. It might be that you have a particular communication strategy that's built around certain renter types or building typologies or scenarios that is fit for purpose. It might be that you have performance criteria that you want to deliver, whether that's acoustic or ventilation performance driven. And finally, you might be bedding in very specific commercial contracts and frameworks to guarantee you're getting what you pay for. That's the presentation from me. Principally what this has been about is to say that ventilation and air quality is important to us all. Far too often we're falling short on the critical pillar that is ventilation, but there are ways to solve that and build processes around getting better outcomes in the housing that we provide. Thank you.